to every question. I say, I arrive in Guatemala. Answer every question. Use your pause button if Guatemala. I arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead, November 1st. Who arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead?
Me. I just
Well, me, AJ.
arrived.
I arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead,
November 1st.
November 1st. Did I arrive in Guatemala on November 3rd?
No, it's November 3rd.
No,
November
no,
1st.
I didn't arrive in Guatemala on November 3rd. I arrived in Guatemala on November 1st. What day did I arrive in Guatemala?
On November 1st.
November 1st. I arrived in Guatemala on
November 1st.
November 1st. Where did I arrive on November 1st?
In Guatemala. I arrived in Guatemala on
Guatemala,
November 1st.
right? I arrived in Guatemala on November 1st. I arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead, November 1st. I was curious about this holiday, so I went to the cemetery to see what was happening. Was I angry about this holiday?
No, I wasn't angry.
No, I wasn't angry about this holiday. Was I sad about this holiday?
I wasn't sad about this holiday.
No, I wasn't sad about this holiday. I was curious about this holiday. Who was curious about this holiday?
I guess
Well, I was, AJ. I was curious about
this
holiday. What was I curious about?
The holiday.
The holiday, right? I was
today.
curious about the holiday. Which holiday was I curious about? Which holiday was I curious about?
The Day of the Dead on November 1st.
The Day of the Dead. I was curious about the Day of the Dead. Was I curious about the Day of the Dead? Or was I curious about Christmas?
The Day of the Dead.
I was curious about the Day of the Dead, of course. I was curious about the Day of the Dead. So I went to the cemetery to see what was happening. Where did I go?
The cemetery.
I went to the cemetery. Did I go to the cemetery or did I go to the airport?
I went to the cemetery.
Easy. I went to the cemetery. Who went to the cemetery?
I went to
AJ.
I went to
the cemetery.
Where
did I go?
The cemetery.
To the cemetery, right. I went to the cemetery. When did I go to the cemetery?
On November 1st.
November 1st, the Day of the Dead, right? I went to the cemetery
on November 1st.
On the Day of the Dead.
November 1st.
November 1st. Why did I go to the cemetery?
Because
to see what was happening. I went to the cemetery to see what was happening. Who went to the cemetery to see what was happening?
Me, I went
AJ,
to the cemetery
went to the cemetery to
was
see
happening.
what was happening.
What was happening?
Where was the cemetery?
Guatemala.
In
Guatemala.
Guatemala. The cemetery was in
Guatemala.
Guatemala. What is the Day of the Dead? A
Is-
holiday. The Day of the Dead is a holiday. When is the Day of the Dead?
On November 1st, the Day of the Dead.
November 1st.
is
The Day of the
the
Dead
dead.
was and is November 1st. So I went to the cemetery on the Day of the Dead to see what was happening. What I found was quite interesting. Was it boring?
No, it wasn't boring.
No, it wasn't boring.
Boring.
Was it interesting?
Yes, it was
It
interesting.
was interesting. The cemetery was
Was
interesting.
interesting.
How did I feel about the cemetery?
I feel curious.
I felt
Serious.
it was interesting.
I felt
Or I
it
thought
was,
It
Um,
was interesting.
it was interesting.
Was it boring or was it interesting?
It was interesting.
It was interesting. Of course, it was interesting. What was interesting?
The holiday. The day
The
of
cemetery. The cemetery was interesting. When was the cemetery interesting?
On November
It was
1st.
interesting on the Day of the
It
Dead,
was interesting.
November 1st.
Day of the Dead on November 1st.
Okay, the atmosphere in the cemetery was like a party.
It's like party.
Was the atmosphere very sad?
No, very.
No,
it's
the
sad.
atmosphere was not sad.
Is
The atmosphere was
It-
like a party.
was
The atmosphere was
Was
very
like-
happy. Was the atmosphere sad or happy?
happy. The atmosphere was
The atmosphere
Happy.
was happy.
happy.
The atmosphere was like a party.
Was like a party.
What was like a party?
The atmosphere.
The atmosphere,
The atmosphere.
the atmosphere in the cemetery was like a party. Where was the atmosphere like a party?
In cemetery. In cemetery.
In the cemetery. Right? The
In
cemetery.
the cemetery.
The atmosphere was like a party in the cemetery. Was the atmosphere like a party at my house?
No, it's my house.
No,
In the cemetery.
no, not at my house.
The
atmosphere was like a party
in the cemetery.
in the cemetery.
The cemetery.
The atmosphere was not like a party
Right.
in my house.
Right.
So the atmosphere was like a party. There were people everywhere.
There were peaceful.
Families were sitting around the graves of their dead ancestors. Where were the families sitting?
Around the grave.
Around the graves.
They,
Right? They were sitting around the graves.
Grave.
Who was sitting around the graves?
Family was sitting around the,
families.
grave.
Right? The families were sitting
Around
around
the
the
grave.
graves. Were they sitting around the trees?
No, they wasn't sitting.
No, they weren't
Wasn't
sitting
sitting
around
around
the
the trees.
They were sitting around the graves.
Grave.
So, where were they sitting?
They were
Around the graves.
Where?
Families were sitting around the
grave.
graves of their dead ancestors. Were they sitting around the graves of their dead ancestors?
Yes.
Yes. They were sitting around
around
the graves of their dead
ancestors.
ancestors. Were they sitting around the graves of their friends?
No, it was sitting around the grave
Really?
of their friends.
They were sitting around the graves of their
Around.
dead ancestors. Who was sitting around the graves?
The family.
That's right. Families were sitting around the graves. Whose graves were they sitting around? Whose graves were they sitting around?
Their ancestor. Their dead ancestor.
Yes, their dead ancestors. Their ancestors. Their ancestors' graves. They were sitting around the graves of their dead ancestors. Were they sitting around the graves of their dead ancestors or the graves of their friends?
They were sitting around the grave of
Ancestors,
their
right? They were
dead
sitting around the
ancestor.
graves of their
Their
dead
ancestor.
ancestors. They cleaned the graves and added fresh flowers. Who cleaned the graves?
The families cleaned the grave. The
What
family,
did they add?
they added fresh flower.
They added
Fresh flower.
fresh flowers.
Fresh flowers.
Did they add food?
No, they didn't add food.
No,
They
they
added
didn't
fresh
add
flour.
food. Did they add money?
No, they didn't add money.
No, they didn't add
They
money.
added fresh
They added
flower.
fresh flowers.
Fresh flower.
What did they clean?
They cleaned the grave.
They cleaned
The
the
grave.
graves. Whose graves did they clean?
Their dead ancestor.
Their ancestors.
The ancestor.
They cleaned their ancestors'
grave.
graves. Where did they add flowers?
They add flower grave
They added flowers to the graves.
to the grave
That's right. They cleaned the graves
and
and
added
added
fresh
fresh
flowers.
Good. I walked through the cemetery and admired the beauty of all the colorful flowers. Where did I walk?
The cemetery. I walked through the cemetery.
I walked
Through the
through the
cemetery.
cemetery. Did I walk through the park?
No, I didn't walk through the park.
No,
I walked
didn't walk through the park.
The
I
cemetery.
walked through
The
cemetery.
cemetery.
Where did I walk?
The
Through
cemetery.
the cemetery. Who walked through the cemetery?
I walked through the cemetery.
I did. AJ.
I
I walked through
through the
the
cemetery.
cemetery. Did I walk through the cemetery? Or did I walk through the park?
I walked through
I
the
walked through
cemetery.
the cemetery. That's right. And I admired the beauty
Admire.
of all the colorful flowers. Did I admire the beauty of the trees?
No, I didn't admire
No.
beauty
I
of the
didn't
tree.
admire the beauty
Admire
of the
beauty
trees.
of the tree.
Did I admire the beauty of the children?
No, I didn't admire
No,
the
you
beauty.
didn't admire the beauty
the
of
beauty.
the children.
The beauty, colorful.
What did I admire?
I admire the
flowers, right?
beauty
Yeah, I
of
admired
the color
the
flower,
beauty of all the colorful
of
flowers.
all colorful flower, all colorful
Who
flower.
admired the beauty of all the colorful flowers?
Me, I just
Yeah, that's
I
right.
admired
AJ, me,
admire
admired the beauty of all the colorful
colorful
flowers.
flowers.
Where were the flowers?
In the cemetery.
On the graves.
On the grave.
Or in the cemetery.
On the grave in the cemetery.
The flowers were on the graves.
In the cemetery.
In the cemetery.
Hmm.
Were the flowers in the park?
No, it wasn't in the
No,
park.
they weren't in the park.
They
Were the
were.
flowers in my house?
They was
No,
in my
they
house.
weren't in my house. Where were the flowers?
They was
The flowers were
on the
on
grave
the graves
in the
in
cemetery.
the cemetery. Where did I walk?
I walked through
I walked through
the cemetery.
When did I walk through the cemetery?
On November 1st. On Day of the Dead.
November 1st, the
On
Day of the Dead. Right, November 1st, the Day of the Dead, I walked through the cemetery. What was the cemetery like? Like a party. It was like a party.
Like party.
The cemetery was like a
ให้
party.
สัญญาณหน่อย